So Spider-Man is probably the most popular comic book character. And for those that are trying to find every single Spider-Man comic there is, you'll realize that some are a lot harder to get than others. There's some Spider-Man comic books out there that are so rare. So I've made a list of some of the rarest Spider-Man comics you'll ever see. And some so rare, there's only 20 copies ever made. So let's bring up some context first so we know what we're talking about. Amazing Fantasy 15, which is the first appearance of Spider-Man, there's roughly about 4,000 copies of this graded, let alone all the copies out there that are ungraded. So comics like that will not be on list. This is for the rarest of the rare. Now, a lot of people are thinking, well, what about Spider-Man 1 from 1990? Now, they had multiple different variants of that, but one of the most rarest variants are probably the gold UPC variant and the platinum edition. Well, the platinum edition was made as a thank you to different retailers, basically comic shops, and that had about 10,000 of a print run. Now you have the gold edition with the UPC, which was actually a variant just for places like Walmart. That's the only place you could buy them. And that also had a print run of about 10,000. So books like that will not be on this list. So let's start the list at 1,000 copies or less. So the first one we got on the list is Amazing Spider-Man #1 from 2022, the variant cover, Hustle variant, the sketch cover where Spider-Man and Eminem are standing next to each other. Now the regular cover had a print run of 5,000, but the sketch variant was a limited print run to 1,000 copies, and for a 9.8, that is going to run you about $1,000. Spider-Man the Second, #1, the Tedesco variant, which is a 1 in 50. There's less than 1,000 copies of this, and that's going to run you about $450. Now, every fair market value I tell you is going to be in a CGC 9.8. Amazing Spider-Man #700, the Ditko variant. There's roughly about 800 to 1,000 copies of this, and this is a 1 in 200 ratio variant, and it's going to run you about $700. What does a ratio variant mean? When I say things like 1 in 200, 1 in 100, 1 in 50, 1 in 1,000, all that means is the retailer, the comic book shop, had to buy 1,000 copies to get the 1 in 1,000 special variant cover. So if something's a 1 in 50, that means a comic shop had to order 50 copies of cover A, and they would get, as an incentive, a 1 in 50 variant cover. So usually how the math works out is you find out how many copies of cover A was sold, and then you can divide by whatever the ratio is, but not every comic book shop will order 200 if there's a 1 in 200 variant. Some comic shops may order 5, so they won't get that one. So you can kind of see what the maximum number of copies is, and then you can kind of roughly go down. It's usually about 50 to 75% of comic book shops will order all that they need to get that special variant. Ultimate Spider-Man #104, the Mark Bagley variant. This is a 1 in 100, and it's only about $100. Just because it's rare doesn't mean it's expensive. They have to have a lot of demand for it. Ultimate Spider-Man #1 from 2023, the Campbell Virgin variant. This is a 1 in 500, and this is about 780 copies, and this is about $400. Spider-Man #1, the Bocelli variant. There's about 700 to 800 copies of this one. It's a 1 in 100, and this is about $500. Amazing Spider-Man 688. This is the Campbell variant. There's about 700 to 800 copies of this. This is a ratio of 1 in 50, and it's about $2,500. Because this is just as rare as some of the other ones, it's all about who wants it and who wants to pay more. Especially on an Amazing Spider-Man run, the original run, those are going to go for a little more than say like an Ultimate Spider-Man or a Spider-Man, something that's not based in the actual Spider-Man run. Ultimate Spider-Man #1, this technically came out a few years after the Ultimate Spider-Man 1 anyways, but this is a Target variant, and there's about 600 copies that are made of this, and a 9.8 is going to be at $200. Ultimate Spider-Man 160, Quesada sketch variant. This is about 500 to 600 copies. It's a 1 in 200, and it's worth about $600. Amazing Spider-Man 654. This is the second printing. Now there's only about 500 to 600 copies of this, and it's going to run you about $3,100. And yes, that is ones that have recently sold for that price. That's what I'm going off of, actual sales. Amazing Spider-Man 648. This is the Campbell variant. There's about 500 to 600 copies of this. This is a 1 in 100, and it's about $1,400. Sinister Ward #1, Peach Momoko variant, limited to 500 copies. It was a store exclusive, and it's worth about $80. And just to give you a heads up on how some of these store exclusives work, there's lots of store exclusives out there. I could have a store variant if I wanted to. You just have to approach Marvel or DC or whoever you're going to, and they approve you, and then you have to pay a ton of money. You know, it's a huge undertaking nonetheless. But in order to make a variant, they usually have a minimum. So they'll have maybe a minimum of 4,000 copies that you have to purchase. Now, if someone does a store variant where there's only 500, usually it's the virgin. So you can mix and match. You can have the non-virgin and the virgin variant, and maybe you have the virgin less, and that can be part of your 3,000 or 4,000, whatever you need to buy from them. But you have to pay for all of them. So most stores, what they do is they want to recoup as much money as possible. So if they did buy all those, like 4,000, they would have to destroy the rest. And there are some companies that do that, just maybe buy 4,000 and then destroy half of them. So it's a limited to only 2,000 of them. So there's a lot of store variants out there that might be 1,000 or 2,000 or 6,000, whatever it is, especially with Spider-Man, more popular character. So they're probably going to be higher store variants that are in the thousands of print runs. Every once in a while, you'll have one that'll be limited to something like this, 500. But again, just because it's limited and there's only so many copies, it's supply and demand. There's not a lot of demand for something like Sinister War, even though it's a Spider-Man comic book. I try to stick mostly just to Spider-Man itself, but I wanted to throw in that one so you could kind of understand how store variants work. Amazing Spider-Man 678 Quinona's variant. There's about 450 to 500 copies of this. It's a 1 in 50, and it's about $5,000. There's a lot of variants around this time frame of Amazing Spider-Man, and at the time, Amazing Spider-Man wasn't selling very well. That's why something like as simple as a 1 in 50 makes it pretty rare. To give you an example, that the cover A of this comic book had an entire print run of 54,000. That's it, only 54,000 copies in total. So getting a 1 in 50 makes this extremely rare. Spider-Man number 2, Pacelli variant. This is going to be out 400 to 500 copies. It's a 1 in 100, and it's going to run you about $1,100. Amazing Spider-Man 4 from about 2014, the Campbell sketch variant. This is about 400 to 500 copies as well, and this is about $250. Amazing Spider-Man 2, also from 2014, Campbell sketch variant. Same amount, 400 to 500 copies, and then this is going to be about $100. Amazing Spider-Man number 1, also from 2014. This is the second printing Cho sketch variant. This is going to have about 300 to 400 copies, and it's going to run you about $100. Next, we've got also from 2014, Amazing Spider-Man 1.1. This is the Alex Ross sketch variant. Now, he did a lot of these sketch variants. They were all 1 in 200s, and so that makes it very rare because there wasn't that many sold of this. For example, there's 116,000 for a print run of this, but you got a 1 in 200. There's less than 300 copies that exist. And to give you an example, there's actually only 89 copies of this graded by CGC, but they're only about $300. Amazing Spider-Man 800, the remastered sketch variant. There's less than 300 copies of this that exists. It was a 1 in 1,000 variant, and it's only about $350. Next, we got Amazing Spider-Man 667. This might be one of the rarest Spider-Man variants of the main series, done by Del Auto, and there's roughly maybe 200 to 300 copies that actually exist of this, and it is a 1 in 100 variant, and this is going to run you $30,000 for a 9.8. Yes, very expensive. Amazing Spider-Man 1.2, this is another Alex Ross variant. Less than 200 copies of this exist. It's a 1 in 200, and it's only going to run you about $100. This had a print run of 85,000. That was it, and there's only 66 graded so far. Amazing Spider-Man number 1 from 2025. This is the Marvel Insider. The way you got this is you had to be part of Marvel's loyalty program for a decent amount of time. There's less than 200 copies of this that exists, and it's going to run you about $1,400. Ultimate Spider-Man number 1 variant, and this is about $500. Amazing Spider-Man 1.3, another Alex Ross variant. This is less than 150 copies. It's a 1 in 200. It's going to be about $100, and it has about a 7,500 print run with only 52 graded copies. Amazing Spider-Man 797. This is the remastered sketch variant. Less than 150 copies of this. It was a 1 in 1,000. It goes for about $200, and there's about 130 copies of this graded total. Amazing Spider-Man number 1 from 2025. This is the C2E2 Virgin variant. Now, the only way you can get this was going to the C2E2 convention, and it was limited to 100. So that's different than a ratio. Limited means they only made 100, and that was it. This is going to run you for a 9.8 about $2,200. Then we got Amazing Spider-Man 1.5, another Alex Ross sketch variant. Less than 100 copies of this exist. It's a 1 in 200. They only had a print run of 64,000 and it's about $100, but there's 62 graded in total. Then we got Amazing Spider-Man 1.4, same thing, Alex Ross sketch variant. It's less than 100 copies of this exists, and it's going to run you about $100. And there's only 36 total graded copies. Spectacular Spider-Man number 300. This is the Frank Miller sketch variant. There's less than 100 copies of this that exists. It's a 1 in 1,000 variant, and it's only about $300. Amazing Spider-Man number 25 from 2017. This is a remastered, less than 100 copies of this exist. It is a 1 in 1,000, and it's gonna run you about $800. So this next one is gonna be a little interesting, but I figured I'd just throw it in there anyways. This is Amazing Spider-Man number 1 from 1999. Dynamic Forces did a variant cover where they had 6,500 that they made. But of the 6,500, 79 in the bottom left-hand side had a sketch by John Romita, and it said dash of 79. So if you have one of those copies, even though it's not quite a variant because it's more of like it has a drawing on it, but nonetheless, only 79 copies of this exist, and it's going to run you about $1,500. Amazing Spider-Man Renew Your Vows number 1, the remastered variant. There's less than 75 copies that exist. It is a 1 in 1,000, and it's about $400, and there's only 42 that have been graded so far. Now this next one's pretty interesting. It's really hard to tell, but from what I've gathered, Amazing Spider-Man number 546, the book market variant, there's less than 75 copies that exist. It's about $1,000, but libraries got with Marvel and they wanted kids to start reading comic books more. So Marvel went ahead and printed a special amount of Amazing Spider-Man 546 and gave them to libraries. Now a lot of these got destroyed. There's probably a print run of close to 1,000, but of course people go in there, they just read them, throw them away, whatever. So a lot of these were gone, destroyed. So that's why they're thinking of less than 75 copies of this exist. And so they're pretty rare and they're very expensive. They rarely come up for sale. So now we're coming into the final 3, and this is the super rare stuff. Amazing Spider-Man 20 from 2019, the Uniglow variant. Most people probably don't even know what that is. There's less than 50 copies that exist. There's only 34 copies that have been graded, and the last one sold in a 9.8 for $10,000. The only way you could have got this was you had to go to some special store and buy 2 t-shirts. And if you bought 2 t-shirts, they gave you this. And so many people didn't know about this, didn't know about the company, didn't even know what the t-shirt company was. And it was a limited edition t-shirt to begin with. So extremely, extremely rare. Then we got Web of Spider-Man number 100 and Amazing Spider-Man 375. You might be thinking, well, that's not rare. Now these are actually cover misprints. They forgot to print on the foil, and so it gives it, so the covers are kind of white or blank without having the foil there that covers it. There's only about 20 to 25 that have been graded so far of these, both of these, and they're pretty rare. It's hard to say how many, but we're probably thinking less than 50 copies of these each that exist. And it can run you from 1,000 to 2,500 to get these different kind of printing manufacturer errors. But the rarest Spider-Man comic of them all is Amazing Spider-Man number 26 from 2023, the Del Auto Virgin variant. This was limited to just 20 copies. That is it, no more than that. And the last one sold for $4,200. So even though it was limited just to 20 copies, it's not the most expensive on the list. That is Amazing Spider-Man 667, because once again, supply and demand. There's a lot of people that want that variant of 667. That's why it commands the most at $30,000. Let me know if there's any other rare comic books you would like me to look at, or if there's any Spider-Man comic books that you think is more rare than the ones that I have on this list. As always, have a great day.